The gym I found was perfect, cheap, open 24/7, and most importantly, it had a large, mirrored basement where I could practice ballet. It was in a sketchy part of town, sure, but I didn't care. The owner gave me a key to the basement since no one else ever used it. It was my secret place, a place where I could train alone, perfect my form, and chase my dream of performing in a real ballet company. That night, after my usual workout, I changed into my leotard and tights, slipped on my ballet slippers, and locked the basement door behind me. I placed my speaker in the corner and turned on my music, letting the haunting melody of Swan Lake fill the empty room. The walls were lined with mirrors, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. The fluorescent lights above cast my reflection 100 times over. I lost myself in the dance, my body moving instinctively, muscles burning with effort. I watched myself in the mirror, checking every line, every extension, until something made me break concentration. As I twirled into a pirouette, I saw it. My reflection wasn't moving. For a fraction of a second, it just stood there, staring at me. I stumbled to a stop, my chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. My reflection was normal now, mirroring my every move. Had I imagined it? Maybe I was just exhausted. With a nervous laugh, I shook my head, packed up my things, and left. Before shutting the door, I glanced at the mirror one last time. Everything looked fine. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. The next night, I returned to the gym, determined to push past my paranoia. After my workout, I unlocked the basement door, changed, and started my routine. The music swelled, my body moved, and I let go of my fears, until I glanced at the mirror again. This time, my reflection was completely gone. My stomach twisted as I scanned the mirror, searching for my own face. Nothing. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I looked down at my feet just for a second, grounding myself, trying to breathe. And then, when I looked back up, my reflection was there again. I rushed forward, pressing my hands against the glass. My reflection followed, moving perfectly in sync. Was I losing my mind? I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that room. But as I turned to grab my bag, I saw it. My reflection's face had changed. It wasn't me anymore. Her eyes were darker, sunken. Her lips twisted into a sinister smirk. She wasn't mimicking me. She was watching me. The lights flickered. Then everything went black. I started to panic. I couldn't see. The room was silent except for the blood rushing in my ears. Then, the sound of footsteps. They were running directly at me. I barely had time to react before something slammed into my chest, sending me flying backwards. I crashed into the mirror, glass shattering around me as I hit the floor hard. Pain shot through my arms and legs, shards of glass cut into my skin. I cried out in pain. Then as suddenly as it all happened, the lights flickered back on. I scrambled to my feet, my limbs shaking, scanning the room. Empty. But the mirror. A massive section had shattered, jagged edges still clinging to the frame. My reflection was still there, but something was wrong. I wasn't moving. The other me was still standing in the mirror, staring at me with those hollow, twisted eyes. I ran. I didn't even change into my ballet clothes. I grabbed my bag and sprinted out of the gym, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. I didn't stop running until I was home, locking every door behind me. After a long shower, I wrapped my cuts and collapsed onto my bed, trying to breathe. I told myself it had been stress, exhaustion, my imagination running wild. But then I saw it. Something glinted in my gym bag. My fingers trembled as I reached inside, pulling it out. A large shard of glass from the broken mirror. And in its reflection, I saw her. Not me, her. A cruel smile stretched across her lips. Her eyes burned into mine with pure malice hunger. I screamed, dropping the glass. As I stumbled backwards, my gaze shot to my vanity mirror across the room. She was standing there, not trapped in the glass anymore. She was in my room. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, an old ballet trophy, and hurled it at the mirror with all my strength. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, and she was gone. I left my apartment that night, moved out the next day. I haven't looked into a mirror since. But sometimes, in the corners of reflective windows, in the darkened glass of my phone screen, I feel her watching, waiting, and I know one day she'll find her way back. Moving to New York City was a dream come true. The consulting firm that hired me was prestigious, the kind of place people work their whole lives to get into. I spent months searching for the perfect apartment, and eventually I found it. Modern, spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It was only a few blocks from work and had everything I needed, including a gym. I've always loved working out. It clears my mind, keeps me focused. Living in a fast-paced city like this, the gym became my sanctuary. It was the one place where I could shut out the noise, the stress, the expectations, and just move. For the first few months, life was perfect. I settled into my job, made friends, explored the city. Everything was going exactly as I planned. Until the day I noticed him. I was on the treadmill when I first saw him, a maintenance worker sitting in the back corner of the gym. He looked to be in his late 50s, his gray uniform slightly wrinkled, a tool belt hanging loosely around his waist. At first, I didn't think much of him. Gym equipment needed maintenance, and someone had to do it. But something was off. He wasn't working, not really. He just sat there on an overturned bucket, his head slightly down. Every time I glanced his way, I could feel it, his eyes on me. The moment I turned my head in his direction, though, he would look away. I told myself I was imagining things. I was used to men staring, making comments. It wasn't new. But something about him sent a chill through me. After 20 minutes of this, I decided I had enough. I grabbed my things and left, an uncomfortable knot twisting into my stomach. The next day was the same. Work, home, gym. I had almost forgotten about the man until I stepped onto the treadmill. And there he was again. This time, he was fixing a different machine. Except he wasn't fixing anything. He was watching me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my run, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes crawling over me. The way he loitered around the corner, the way his hands remained idle. It wasn't normal. After 5 minutes of trying to pretend he wasn't there, I gave up. I turned off the treadmill and left. The next morning, I went early, hoping to avoid him. And I did. It was the best workout I'd had in weeks. But when I got back to my apartment, something else went wrong. The shower barely worked, just a weak, pathetic trickle of water. I sighed, frustrated. I needed a shower, and now I had to deal with maintenance. I called the office and explained the issue. They said someone would be up shortly. Not even 10 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was him. An unsettling smile stretched across his face before I even said a word, as if he had been expecting me. He told me he was here to fix the shower. I just nodded. Part of me wanted to shut the door, tell him I'd wait for someone else. But I had no real reason to refuse him. He was maintenance. It was his job. I stepped aside and let him in. He went straight to the bathroom. I stayed in the living room, staring at the clock, counting the seconds. 5 minutes, 10, 15. When he finally came back, I felt a wave of relief. He said it was fixed, some valve issue. I thanked him, expecting him to leave. But he didn't. He just stood there. A thick, suffocating silence filled the room. His eyes never left me. Then he spoke again. Told me I could shower now. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I told him I'd shower later. He smiled, and then slowly he walked to the front door and let himself out. The moment the door shut, I felt sick. I sat on the couch, my body stiff, my skin crawling with a feeling I couldn't shake. My apartment no longer felt like mine. But then, my phone rang. Brad. I had met him through a friend at a party a few weeks ago. He was a cop, funny, charming, the kind of guy that made you feel safe. We had texted here and there, but I had been waiting for him to ask me out. Tonight, he finally did. For the first time all day, I felt normal again. I spent the next few hours getting ready, pushing everything else out of my mind. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, I met Brad outside and we walked to a nice Italian restaurant. Dinner was perfect, great food, even better company. It wasn't until we were about to leave that I realized something. My keys were gone. I searched everywhere, my purse, my coat, the table, nothing. Brad reassured me, told me not to worry. The office had to keep spares. He was right. I felt instantly relieved at this thought. When we got back to my building, the receptionist went to grab the spare key. But when they returned, their expression had changed. The spare key was missing. They asked if I had ever lost it before. I hadn't. A cold weight settled in my stomach. They called security. He would let me into my apartment, and they would have another key made in the morning. Brad offered to come up with me. I hesitated, but agreed. I liked Brad, but I also wasn't the kind of person to let someone come up to my apartment after a first date. But also, with as crazy as today had been, Brad was the only thing at the moment that made me feel normal. I smiled and said that he could make sure I made it safe and sound. He laughed and followed me up to my apartment. The security officer unlocked the door and we stepped inside. The officer told us to have a good night and shut the door behind him. Brad complimented my apartment. I thanked him and told him I was going to change. He asked where the bathroom was. I pointed and then went to my room and shut the door. I was halfway undressed when I heard it, a loud thud. It sounded like Brad was yelling at someone. Another loud bang. I ran into the bathroom and froze. Brad was on the ground, fighting him, the maintenance man. My stomach lurched. Brad shouted at me to call the police. My hand shook as I fumbled for my phone, dialing with trembling fingers. When the police arrived, they arrested him. And that's when I learned the truth. The man had been watching me for weeks. He had pictures of me on his phone, some taken from inside my own apartment. They also found the spare key from the office. He had stolen them, which is how he was able to get in and out of my apartment. I don't know what would have happened if Brad hadn't been there that night, and if I had walked into that bathroom alone. I don't even let myself think about it. But every time I walk into my own apartment, I double-check the locks, I check the corners, the closets, under the bed. Because for the first time in my life, I learned that nightmares aren't just things that live in the dark. Sometimes they wear uniforms, and sometimes they have keys. There's something about rowing that makes me feel alive. The rhythm of the oars cutting through the water, the way the boat glides effortlessly, the endless stretch of blue surrounding me. Nothing else in the world compares. It's the ultimate workout, the kind that tests your endurance and leaves you feeling completely drained but satisfied. That's why, even outside of my university's rowing team practices, I'd take my own boat out onto Lake Champlain whenever I had the chance. It was my escape, my personal challenge. And I never went alone. Lucky, my black lab, was always my companion. He loved the water just as much as I did, if not more. Every time I set the boat in the water, he'd leap in excitedly, tail wagging, ready for another adventure. That Saturday was no different. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, light breeze, sun high in the sky. No obligations, no distractions. Just me, my boat, and my dog. I set my goal, as I always did. Row 5 miles out, to the spot where both shorelines disappeared, where it felt like I was rowing in the middle of the ocean. That sense of being completely alone, surrounded by only vastness of the lake, gave me an adrenaline rush. It was exhilarating. The way there was smooth, no other boats in sight, which was unusual but welcome. I pushed myself harder, determined to beat my best time. My arms burned, sweat dripped down my back, but I kept going. Finally, just a few minutes over an hour, I reached my destination. I let the boat drift, stretching out my sore muscles. Lucky sat in the front, panting happily, taking in the endless water around us. I reached for my water bottle and protein bar, letting myself enjoy the stillness. Out of nowhere, Lucky started barking. It was abrupt, sharp, and it was wrong. Lucky never barked unless something was really wrong. His ears were pinned back, his body tense. He was staring off to the left of the boat, completely fixated on something in the water. I followed his gaze, scanning the surface. Nothing, just gentle ripples. Then I saw it. Something just beneath the water. It was hard to make out, just a dark shape, a few feet under the surface, moving steadily in our direction. At first I thought it was a log, but logs don't move like that. A few moments later, something broke the surface. It was fast, a brief fleeting glimpse, just long enough for me to see what it looked like. A head. An animal's head. But not like anything I had ever seen before. I barely had time to process it before I realized something terrifying. It was huge, and it was coming straight for us. Panic set in. My hands scrambled for the oars, heart pounding. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't want to be anywhere near it. Then, the water exploded. A massive body surfaced, glistening and wet, sending waves crashing into my boat. At least 15, maybe 20 feet long. A long serpentine neck, dark greenish-gray skin, and ridges running down its back. I had seen this before, not in real life, but in blurry photos and grainy videos and legends. It looked exactly like the Loch Ness Monster, except this wasn't Scotland. This was Lake Champlain. Champ. That's what they called it. The local legend, the supposed lake monster. I had always thought it was just a story, something for tourists, a myth. But this thing, this enormous living thing, was real, and I was in the water with it. Before I could react, my boat lurched, the impact sending me flying, cold water swallowing me whole. I tumbled, disoriented, spinning in the depths, my lungs screaming. Then, movement. Something enormous passed right by me. For the briefest moment, I saw it in full. Its long tail, powerful, cutting through the water. Its massive body gliding just feet away from me. It wasn't attacking, it was just there, moving, existing in the same space as me. Forgetting everything else, I kicked hard, breaking the surface, gasping for air. Lucky was already in the boat, barking frantically. I didn't even stop to think. I reached for the edge, threw myself over, and pulled myself in. My hands were shaking, my breathing was erratic, but I was alive, and I needed to get out of there. I rowed like my life depended on it, because maybe it did. Every stroke burned, my arms felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was following me. By the time I reached the dock, I was drenched, exhausted, and shaking. But I had beaten my best time, 40 minutes. I was pretty sure that was an Olympic-level pace. That night, I did something that I've never done before. I researched. I read everything I could about Champ, the eyewitness accounts, the old photographs, the legends passed down for centuries. I had never believed in it before. I do now. I don't think it wanted to hurt me. If it did, it easily could have. It was just there, part of the lake, something that had been hiding for longer than any of us realized. But I never rowed out to that spot again. I still love the water. I still love rowing. But now I know that some places aren't meant to be explored.